Praise be Jesus and Mary.
Now and forever.
Among St. Paul's letters, there are three that are called pastoral because they contain exhortations and advice to pastors. They are addressed to two pastors by name, and these are two letters to St. Timothy and one to St. Titus. We had our first reading from the second letter to St. Timothy. Timothy was the bishop of Ephesus, while Titus became the bishop on the Isle of Crete. We heard in the first reading how much St. Paul loved the former, and the latter was also a valuable collaborator. The apostle addresses them similarly. He writes, "To Timothy, my true child in faith, and to Titus, my true child in our common faith." But writing to the Philippians, he said of St. Timothy, "I have no one comparable to him for the genuine interest in whatever concerns you." He is, St. Timothy, the co-sender of the letter to the Philippians, the second letter to the Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon, as well as Colossians and 2 Thessalonians. According to St. Jerome, Timothy also served as St. Paul's translator. While St. Paul knew Greek, he was not quite expert or perfect in it, so he could use some help to write in better Greek, which was at that time the common language of the Mediterranean. The holy bishop was born at Lystra in Asia Minor, about 120 miles away from northwest of Damascus. His mother was Jewish, but his father was pagan, and this is probably why he was not circumcised as a child. Nevertheless, he was brought up in the scriptures, taught the scriptures from his infancy. So when St. Paul came in his first missionary journey into Asia Minor and evangelized Lystra, that's probably when Timothy's grandmother and mother became Christians. And St. Paul returned again during his second missionary journey. At that point, Timothy was already a respected member of the Christian community. And also in Iconium, 20 miles to the north, St. Timothy was known and respected. And St. Paul wanted Timothy, therefore, to come with him on this missionary journey, and he had him circumcised, which is something of a surprising choice, since St. Paul had never had Titus circumcised, and he was making this second missionary journey for the express purpose of letting everyone know that the Council of Jerusalem had decided that circumcision was not necessary for Christians. But Timothy had a Jewish mother and so ought to have been circumcised, and circumcision would give him all the rights of a Jew, which he could use to evangelize. He could go into the synagogues and preach Christ. So it may have been already at this point that he was ordained. And Holy Orders is that gift of God to which St. Paul refers to in the reading, the one that St. Timothy had through the imposition of St. Paul's hands. So in that second missionary journey, after accompanying Paul and Silas into various places in Asia Minor and then over to Greece, to the northern Roman province in Greece, which is called Macedonia, he was considered ready to work on his own, or work together with Silas initially, without St. Paul's presence, either going ahead of St. Paul to prepare things to begin to preach Jesus, or remaining in a city while St. Paul moved on, remaining in order to consolidate the church, to complete their instruction, ordain priests, and so forth. And he became thus an authoritative representative of St. Paul, one in whom St. Paul could put his complete trust and to whom he could entrust particularly difficult missions. So in 1 Corinthians and Philippians, St. Paul says that he intends to send Timothy to them, and 1 Thessalonians talks about how Timothy has already been sent there to strengthen and encourage them in their faith. So he was not just an emissary that could carry a message and bring back news. He was actually someone who could take St. Paul's place when the apostle was unable to go. So our first reading is a final letter, or the beginning of the final letter of St. Paul to Timothy before St. Paul's martyrdom. And in it, Paul warns Timothy to avoid becoming entangled in controversies, useless controversies, but rather to continue to be bold in opposing false teaching and to uphold the traditions handed on to him. You kind of get the idea that they had somewhat different personalities. St. Paul, maybe more zealous, courageous, and the sort that might have to be restrained lest he do something imprudent, while St. Timothy was more the reserved type who needed to be encouraged to speak boldly for the faith. So in St. Timothy was at that point when the second letter is written in Ephesus, working on building up the church and ordaining priests and bishops. That was the subject of St. Paul's first letter to Timothy, instructions about how he was to go about this. And in the second letter, he asks him to come to Rome, where St. Paul was in prison and would soon undergo martyrdom. And St. Paul at that point had no one with him but St. Luke. He had previously had St. Timothy with him, but St. Timothy had gone to Dalmatia to evangelize there. So he very much wanted to see Timothy before the end. And have what such consolation as that great saint could give him. So according to Eusebius, the ancient church historian, after St. Paul's death, St. Timothy became the bishop of Ephesus. And a late document tells the story of St. Timothy's martyrdom. According to it, this took place in 97 AD, about 30 years after the martyrdom of St. Paul. So you can imagine 30 years of being a bishop, of preaching, of going around Asia Minor, helping to establish churches, dealing with controversies, combating heresy. And then comes the martyrdom when he was trying to stop the excesses of a pagan festival called Catagogia, but instead of stopping their irrational behavior, the pagans he was trying to convince to be reasonable turned on him and killed him with stones and clubs. His relics remained there in Ephesus until 356, when they were brought to Constantinople, and then they remained there for another 8 centuries until some irritated crusaders sacked the city and carried off many things, including the relics of St. Timothy. Those wound up in Termoli in southern Italy along the Adriatic coast, and were buried hidden under the main altar of the cathedral by the bishop, and remained there without anyone knowing exactly where they were until they were rediscovered by accident in 1945 when they were doing other work. As for St. Titus, he has a Latin name, even though he was Greek by birth, but part of the Roman Empire. And so he was pagan by birth. He didn't know the scriptures from his childhood, but then when the message of the gospel arrived, he became a Christian, and he too showed great holiness, great maturity, so that St. Paul took him with him to Jerusalem for the Council of Jerusalem. So this was before he took St. Timothy with him. And so that Council of Jerusalem is what decided that it was not necessary for other non-Jewish converts to observe the whole Jewish law. And so we also see Timothy along with, or rather Titus along with Timothy helping in this work. So after Timothy leaves Corinth, St. Paul sends Titus there to help resolve the many problems in that community. And he succeeded in restoring peace between the Corinthians and St. Paul. From there, he was again sent out in order to gather together the collection that was being taken up for the Christians in Jerusalem. And so after that, we hear of him being bishop in Crete. We hear and in that same letter addressed to him as bishop in Crete, similar to the letter to Timothy, because in Crete he has to set up the church, the hierarchy, and just consolidate the preaching, the faith. After that, he's invited to come to meet the apostle at Nicopolis in Epirus, and then later, of course, we know that he went to Dalmatia. So reports of him after the Bible say that he died in his 90s. So after, obviously, a long life dedicated to serving God. So these two were collaborators of the apostles, like the 72 collaborators of the apostles, of the 12 apostles in the Gospel. They carried out the same mission both during and after the life of St. Paul. And it is this mission that the Church, and especially the clergy, must continue always, even in our day. And so the example of these saints and St. Paul's teaching to them has a perennial relevance. Praised be Jesus and Mary.
Now and forever.